The welding torch hissed, a steady, aggressive sound that cut through the industrial hum of the site. Blue light flared, casting sharp, jagged shadows against the massive steel beams stacked floor to ceiling. Tyler Morgan leaned into the weld, the heat radiating through his gloves, stinging his skin even through the layers. Every spark that danced away from the seam carried the smell of ozone and burning metal. He had been at this for 10 hours. His back burned, a dull, throbbing ache that pulsed in time with the rhythmic flicker of the arc. He wiped a hand across his forehead, leaving a dark streak of soot across his skin. He didn't look up. He didn't blink. He just held the torch steady, fighting the tremor in his muscles as the light continued to sear the metal into place. The shop was cavernous, loud, and unforgiving. Tyler felt the weight of the day pressing down on his shoulders, his boots heavy, his movements sluggish as the shift finally began to wind toward its end. He pulled the visor up, the sudden dimness of the room feeling like a physical relief, and let out a long, ragged breath. Tyler stepped away from the workbench, his legs stiff, his joints popping as he walked toward the locker room. The air here was filled with the smell of stale coffee and laughter. Beside him, 3 coworkers were huddled by the lockers, their voices loud and sharp. They were talking about trucks, new ones, 4-wheel drives with lifted frames and leather interiors. One man leaned back, gesturing with a thick roll of bills, describing a weekend trip to a coastal resort. The others chimed in, tossing around prices and plans for luxury upgrades. Tyler reached his own locker and leaned against the cold metal. He looked down at his boots. The leather was cracked, the soles worn thin enough to feel every pebble on the workshop floor. He listened to the talk of vacations and gas-guzzling engines, the words washing over him like static. He didn't speak. He didn't join the laughter. He just felt the dampness of his socks and the quiet, gnawing pressure of his own bank balance. Every word they said made the gap between their lives feel wider. He turned the dial on his lock, the click sounding like a gavel in the small, crowded space, and pulled his bag from the shelf. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and cold pavement. Tyler gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, the silence of the car amplifying the echoes of his father. He saw him clearly. 40 years of concrete, dust, and heavy lifting etched into every line of the man's face. He remembered the final day of his father's career. There was no gold watch. There was no celebration. There was only a cardboard box, a few hand tools, and a pension that barely covered the monthly rent on a drafty apartment. His father had given his spine, his knees, and his time to build the structures of the city, yet he ended with nothing to show for it. No savings, no assets. Just a lifetime of fatigue that never quite washed off. Tyler stared at the road ahead, the image of his father sitting at a kitchen table, counting coins for groceries, burning in his mind. It was a mirror of his own future if he continued this path. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was walking the same worn-out road, heading toward the same empty horizon. He gripped the wheel tighter, his jaw set, and vowed that the cycle of exhaustion would end with him. Tyler pushed his front door open. The house was cold, the air still and heavy. He ignored the flickering bulb in the hallway and walked straight to the kitchen table. He shoved a pile of unpaid utility bills aside, his movements sharp and deliberate. He pulled open the drawer, searching for a pen, pushing aside old receipts and a broken screwdriver. His fingers brushed against a worn, paper-bound volume he had picked up at a second-hand shop earlier that week. He pulled it out. The pages were yellowed, the edges frayed, yet the weight of it felt solid in his palm. He needed more than just a thought. He needed an anchor. He grabbed a scrap of notebook paper, the edges jagged from being torn in haste, and flattened it against the wooden tabletop. He uncapped the pen, the smell of ink sharp and clean. He pressed the tip to the surface, the paper dimpling under the pressure of his grip. He wrote slowly, forming each letter with a steady, unyielding hand. Become financially independent before 45. He stared at the line. It looked small, almost insignificant against the vast, dark expanse of the table. But it was there. It was real. The mission had a name. And for the first time in his life, the path forward felt like a map. The first test arrived on a Friday. The envelope felt heavier than usual, a thin stack of paper representing 2 weeks of heavy lifting and burning sparks. Tyler sat at the kitchen table, the light of dawn filtering through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He held the check in his hand. He could already imagine the items it could buy. A better meal, a night out, a small upgrade to make the week feel less grueling. The temptation was a physical weight, pulling at his resolve. He stood up, walked to his laptop, and opened the banking portal. His heart rhythm was steady, but his focus was absolute. He input the numbers, his fingers hovering over the keys. He calculated 20%. It was a significant slice of his labor, a portion of his life force he was choosing to lock away. He clicked the transfer button. The screen flashed a confirmation. The money vanished from his checking account and moved into the brokerage. A sharp sting of immediate scarcity hit him, a sudden realization of what he had just surrendered. Yet, as he watched the balance update, a new sensation took hold. It was not joy, but a cold, hard spark of potential. The machine was running now. The first gear had turned, and there was no turning back. The social pressure of the workshop was a constant low-frequency hum. On Friday afternoons, the conversation always drifted toward the same targets. The latest high-end gadgets, weekend trips to the coast, and the lure of new vehicle financing. His coworkers leaned against the workbench, their voices animated, gesturing toward the parking lot where the newest models sat gleaming in the sun. They looked at Tyler, waiting for his participation, expecting him to join the chorus of consumption. He said nothing. He kept his eyes on his own tasks, his silence becoming a wall. They labeled him stingy. They whispered about his lack of vision, interpreting his restraint as a failure to enjoy life. Tyler felt the prickle of their judgment, a sharp, cold sting that he had to learn to ignore daily. He walked away from their circle, retreating to his station. While they traded their paychecks for objects that would depreciate by the month, he opened his brokerage application. He moved the digits into index funds. He chose the slow, invisible climb over the immediate shallow shine. The loneliness of the path was heavy, but as he watched the numbers shift, he realized the silence was not a void. It was the sound of his future being built, one asset at a time, hidden from those who could only see the present. The seasons blurred into a single, unending cycle of heat and sparks. Overtime became his default, a relentless march through 10 and 12-hour shifts that left his muscles screaming for rest. The blinding blue light of the torch became the only sky he knew, searing his retinas and coating his skin in a fine layer of industrial grit. Every movement was a calculation of effort versus reward. His back throbbed with a dull, constant ache, and his eyes burned from the persistent glare of melting metal. Yet, in the quiet moments between shifts, he checked his phone. The account balance was no longer just a number. It was a physical weight in his pocket, a secret anchor that kept him grounded when the physical exhaustion threatened to pull him under. The burning in his limbs didn't stop, but it changed. It was no longer the fatigue of a man going nowhere. It was the exertion of a man building a foundation. He felt the tension in his shoulders ease when he saw the compound interest ticking upward, a silent surge of power that shielded him from the despair of his labor. He pushed the torch harder, his hands steady despite the trembling in his grip. The grinding work was the price he paid for his future, and for the first time he found he could afford it. The rhythm of the shop floor remained steady, a mechanical heartbeat that Tyler had synchronized with his own goals. He returned to the welding station, the familiar scent of ozone and burning metal filling his lungs. He looked down at his palms, calloused and mapped with faint scars, and then back at the ledger in his mind. The numbers were not just digits anymore. They were a growing force, a silent momentum that operated entirely outside the view of the men shouting around him. He took satisfaction in the deception of his own existence. To his peers, he was merely the man who worked the extra hours, the one who never splurged on tools or weekend outings. They saw a laborer trapped in a routine, but Tyler saw an architect of his own liberation. He checked his account during a brief break, the screen flickering in the dim light of the back office. The total had crossed a new threshold. He felt the sharp, quiet thrill of the gain. It was a secret victory, one in the shadows of heavy machinery and industrial dust. He wiped his hands on a rag, tucked the phone away, and stepped back into the blinding glare of the torch. The work was still demanding, but the burden had changed. Every strike of the arc now felt like a brick being laid into a foundation that only he could see. The workshop air turned stagnant on a Tuesday afternoon. A contractor was in the shop, his boots thick with dried concrete, discussing a project with the foreman. Tyler paused his welding, his visor flipped up, and caught the man talking about cash flow and tenant occupancy. The words hit Tyler with more force than the arc itself. He approached the man while the foreman walked away. The contractor held a set of blueprints, the pages curled and marked with notes. He spoke of compound interest, not as a banking term, but as a lever for building wealth. He explained how a single rental unit could generate income while the owner slept. Tyler listened, his hands still coated in grease, his mind racing to calculate the difference between his hourly wage and the math the man was describing. The man pointed at a sketch of a small house on the blueprints. It was a tangible asset, a physical piece of property that could work for him. The realization settled in his chest like iron. His current path was a ladder, but this was a foundation. He looked at his own hands, then back at the drawings. The shop noise faded into the background. He realized he had been working for money, but he had not yet learned how to make money work for him. The shift was absolute. The search began the following week. Tyler spent his nights scouring property listings, his eyes tracing the lines of small, modest houses that were finally within his reach. He felt a new kind of friction in his chest. It was no longer the fatigue of the shop, but the sharp, electric anxiety of a life-altering commitment. He walked into the bank, his palms damp, and sat across from a loan officer who looked at him with detached curiosity. The paperwork was a mountain of fine print and binding obligations. Every clause he read felt like a tether pulling him toward a future he could not fully predict. He had saved every cent for years, but looking at the loan terms, he realized how thin his safety net actually was. If the house sat vacant, if the pipes burst, if the market shifted, the consequences would be his alone. The fear was a cold weight. He walked out of the bank with a thick folder tucked under his arm, the documents pressing against his ribs like a warning. He stood on the sidewalk, the city noise muffled by his own racing pulse. He had spent his life avoiding debt, and now he was stepping directly into its center. The threshold was narrow, and he had to cross it alone. The office was quiet, smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. Tyler sat across from the cellar, the folder from the bank open between them. The document felt heavy, the ink of the contract dark and final. He picked up the pen. It felt awkward in his grip, calloused by years of handling welding tools. He scanned the numbers one last time. The total debt was a staggering figure, a commitment that stretched out over decades of his life. His pulse thrummed in his ears. He thought of the hours at the shop, the weeks of saving every spare dollar, and the quiet sacrifices that had brought him to this desk. The seller checked his watch. The silence in the room sharpened. Tyler looked at the signature line. If he signed, there was no turning back to the safety of his simple savings account. He exhaled a long, steady breath, pressed the pen to the paper, and wrote his name. The scratching sound of the nib against the page seemed to echo. He set the pen down. The deed was signed. The weight of the mortgage settled onto his shoulders, immediate and undeniable. He stood up, his legs feeling stiff, and shook the seller's hand. He walked out of the office and into the daylight, no longer just a worker, but a property owner. The first month was a gauntlet of small failures. 3 days after the tenant moved in, a pipe groaned in the wall and surrendered. Tyler spent his Saturday under the kitchen sink, his hands slick with water and pipe sealant, wrenching a rusted nut until his knuckles bled. The cost of the repair ate into the expected profit. He wiped his face, staring at the damp floorboards, wondering if the gamble was failing before it had even begun. He returned to the workshop on Monday, the smell of damp wood still clinging to his fingers. He worked the torch with a renewed, cold focus. Then, the envelope arrived. It sat on his kitchen table, thin and unassuming. He tore it open. The check inside was real. It represented the first time money had worked for him while he was busy working for someone else. He stood in the quiet kitchen, the paper firm between his thumb and index finger. The math was simple, but the result was transformative. He deposited the funds immediately. The cycle was no longer a theory. It was a functioning machine. He looked at his calendar, marked the next maintenance date, and headed back to the workshop with a steady, relentless pace. The rhythm of the work became his anchor. Each month, the rent checks arrived, and Tyler did not touch the money. He treated the income like a new seed. He scouted the neighborhood, watching for properties that others overlooked. When the second house went up for sale, he leveraged the equity from the first. The paperwork was familiar now, the process stripped of its initial terror. He signed the second deed, then the third, stacking his assets like steel beams in the shop. By the time he reached 35, he held the keys to 3 separate properties. The momentum shifted. Before, he had to chase every dollar. Now, the portfolio began to hum with its own internal energy. He stood in the workshop, watching the blue light of the torch, and realized the math had taken over. Each property generated cash, which he poured into the next investment, creating a cycle that no longer required his constant, frantic intervention. The weight of the world felt different when he realized his future was being built by the houses, not just his own tired hands. He was no longer just welding steel. He was welding a foundation that could not be easily undone. The machine was running, and it was gathering speed with every passing month. The shop floor remained his primary station. He spent his days bathed in the harsh, flickering blue light of the torch, his hands steady as he fused iron. To his coworkers, he was just another man clocking hours, his movements as predictable as the rhythm of the machinery. They saw a man who never bought a new car and brought the same thermos to work every day. They assumed he was struggling. They did not see the notifications on his phone during his brief breaks. While they gossiped about credit card debt and weekend parties, his portfolio was quietly compounding in the background. The digits grew, silent and invisible. He kept his head down, his focus fixed on the weld. He did not want the attention that came with visible success. He preferred the anonymity of the workshop, where his true wealth remained a secret known only to his bank statements. He wiped the soot from his forehead and returned to the metal. The heat of the torch was intense, but the certainty of his hidden foundation was cooler, sharper. He worked with the quiet satisfaction of a man who owned his time. He was not there to impress the room. He was there to finish the job, collect the paycheck, and return to the life he was slowly building behind a facade of ordinary labor. The shop was loud, but the apprentice moved with a frantic energy that cut through the noise. He stopped near the welding station, his gaze scanning the workspace with a look of pointed confusion. He looked at the floor, then back at Tyler. The young man shifted, his own wrist catching the light as he checked a brand new watch. He tapped the dial, then gestured at the workshop floor. "You have been here longer than anyone, Tyler, yet you stay in this spot, doing the same heavy work day after day?" The apprentice leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I hear the rumors. I see the accounts. People talk about the stocks you play. Tell me the ticker symbol. What is the secret stock that makes a man stay here by choice?" He waited, eyes wide with the hunger for a shortcut. Tyler stood still, the torch nozzle cooling in his grip. The apprentice did not look at the metal. He looked at the shine of his own watch, waiting for a tip that would grant him instant status. The air between them tightened as the apprentice laughed. A sharp, dismissive sound. He did not want a lesson in patience. He wanted a miracle in a ticker symbol. Tyler stared at the young man, his hands caked in years of iron dust, and felt the weight of the gap between them. Tyler wiped his visor clean, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at the younger man, whose eyes were still fixed on the reflection of his own watch. The noise of the shop faded into a low, metallic hum. Tyler stepped forward, his boots grounding him against the concrete. "Don't try to look rich," he said, his voice flat and steady. "Try to become rich." The words hung in the air, stripped of any pretense. The apprentice blinked, his expression shifting from anticipation to a dull, confused flicker of disappointment. He had expected a name, a code, a shortcut to the life he saw in magazines. Instead, he heard a truth that demanded everything he was currently avoiding. He scoffed, a short, sharp sound of rejection, and shook his head as if Tyler were speaking a dead language. He turned his back, already looking for someone else to provide the answer he wanted to hear. He walked away with a quick, restless stride, his gaze scanning the shop for a different kind of mentor. Tyler watched him vanish into the shadows near the loading dock. He did not call out again. He simply turned back to the steel, adjusted his grip on the torch, and ignited the flame. The blue light flared, blinding and pure, casting the rest of the world into darkness. The rhythm of the work became a pulse. Years bled into one another, marked not by seasons, but by the steady, invisible growth of his portfolio. Every paycheck was a sacrifice, a portion of his labor diverted into assets that worked while he stood in the blinding glare of the welding shop. He kept his head down. He kept the spending low. While the world around him chased the noise of the next trend, Tyler fed the machine of his own future. He watched the numbers climb, a slow, silent ascent. By his early 40s, the math had shifted. The interest earned began to dwarf the wages he traded his hours for. It was a subtle, tectonic change in his life. He felt it in the way he walked, the way he breathed when the shop floor grew quiet. The finish line was no longer a dream. It was a calculation. He reached the final stretch of the 23-year climb. Every small choice he had made, the skipped vacations, the ignored luxury, the relentless reinvestment was now converging into a single, massive weight of security. He stood in the workshop, his hands steady, his eyes fixed on the steel, knowing the end of the grind was only days away. The cycle was complete. The office was empty. The air felt thin and cool, a stark change from the heavy, metallic heat of the shop he had left behind. Tyler set his bag on the desk and pulled out his laptop. He sat in the chair, the leather creaking in the stillness. Outside, the city lights flickered against the window, distant and cold. He pressed the power button. The screen hummed to life, casting a pale glow across his hands, which were still calloused from decades of labor. He navigated the menus, his fingers moving with a practiced steady rhythm. He paused for a heartbeat, his cursor hovering over the final account. The weight of 23 years pressed against his chest. He clicked. The data began to load, a series of graphs and totals unfolding across the screen. He watched the numbers align, digit by digit, recalculating the sum of his labor. The final figure solidified in the center of the display. It flickered once, then held steady. $1,142,000. He blinked, reading the digits again to be sure. There was no sound in the room except for the soft whir of the cooling fan, yet the screen seemed to roar with the reality of the sum. He had arrived. Tyler leaned back into the chair, the backrest catching his weight. The screen remained lit, the seven-figure sum glowing against the darkening room. He stopped reading the numbers and started listening to the space around him. There was nothing. No hiss of a welding torch, no shouting over the grinding of industrial machinery, no metallic tang of ozone burning in the air. The silence was heavy, thick with a different kind of pressure. He let his hands fall into his lap, palms open, feeling the absence of the tools he had gripped for 23 years. The contrast hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had spent his entire adult life in a constant state of noise, surrounded by the cacophony of sparks and steel. Now, there was only the steady, rhythmic pulse of his own breathing. He closed his eyes for a second, trying to reconcile the vibration of the shop floor that still lingered in his muscles with the absolute stillness of this office. The transition was complete. He had traded the roar of the fire for the quiet of the vault. He was no longer a participant in the grind. He was the architect of the silence that followed it. Tyler stood up and walked to the window. The glass was cold against his fingertips. Below him, the city stretched out, a dense grid of golden light and shadow. He looked at the horizon, realizing that the skyline was not built by grand gestures or sudden fortune, but by the relentless stacking of one block upon another. Every dollar he had diverted, every weekend he had stayed in to study the books, every small sacrifice of comfort, they were the invisible foundation of this view. He traced the path of a major highway with his eyes, thinking of the thousands of people currently working shifts just like the one he had finally walked away from. He had not won a lottery. He had not discovered a shortcut. He had simply outlasted the distractions. He pressed his palm against the pane, feeling the vibration of a distant train. The city was a machine of millions of moving parts, and for the first time, he saw his own life as a series of deliberate, quiet movements that had compounded into this moment. He did not need a celebration. The view itself was the evidence. He turned away from the window, leaving the lights behind, and walked toward the exit. The work was done.